Hello and welcome to the DVD audio commentary for The Priory School. My name is Jonathan Sothcott and I'll be moderating this session.
My name's John Madden. I'm the director of The Priory School.
And I'm Stuart Davies. I'm the author of Bending the Willow, Jeremy Brett's Sherlock Holmes, and also starring Sherlock Holmes, and editor of the Sherlock magazine.
John, could you tell us how you actually first came to be attached to this project?
I think they called me up and asked me if I was interested. Granada Television, Mike Cox and June Wyndham-Davis were producing the series at the time, and I'd been a Conan Doyle fan, as I guess many of my generation had been. And they were very tempting opportunities, these projects, to make an hour-long film, because they were really quite cinematic, I think, in their potential. So I kind of jumped at the chance.
This is one of the better stories in The Return of Sherlock Holmes. It was originally published in the Strand magazine in 1904, and I think we were talking earlier that there's a nice sort of dynamic with the rhythm of the story, that it lends itself to sort of almost a three-act drama. Would you agree on that?
I would, and also it's got a great opening here, which actually is rendered pretty accurately from the book. I mean, it's a little pre-title sequence, not the this montage here of the lost child, as it were, but certainly it's got that very explosive beginning, you know, with Huxtable coming in and collapsing on the floor, which is kind of a gift, really.
I think that's marvellous, because Conan Doyle sometimes created openings which don't even work on the page because they're just too melodramatic. And there are two openings in the stories. One in which a man comes in so distressed he bangs his head against the wall, and you think, how could you ever portray that? That's in The Beryl Coronet. And this one, where the man comes in and faints, it's risible to some extent, but the film version of it creates it beautifully, and it works tremendously, I think.
Well, I think that one of the things is really related to what I was saying earlier, is that they have such a high style, these stories, that they invite a kind of cinematic expressionism that you would not get away with or you would not have the opportunity to create in a more naturalistic kind of story. And I think Jeremy Brett, for example, instinctively understood that character is such an extraordinarily heightened creation. And Jeremy continued that heightening process in the way that he played him. But the whole style of storytelling sits on Jeremy's performance, or certainly it does for me.
There's some wonderful cuts in this opening sequence as well, from the sort of dramatic flop on the carpet to that beautiful City of Westminster Choir, I think it was, singing, and you know, the connection between this rather extreme gentleman and the beautiful school that he represents. And I think the story also, in the original and in Trevor's screenplay, is this business about bursting and pomposity of this gentleman here who sees himself as quite a sort of high-flying bloke with having written the Sidelights of Horace, which he mentions, and Jeremy dismisses it very quickly. And also when he says "my neighbour," the Duke of Holderness, when you cut very quickly to that grand stately home.
Yes.
It's an amusing cut, that, Harry.
Well, I think, Conan Doyle often worked with this sort of reductio ad absurdum. Holmes is constantly delineated in contrast to the people that he comes up against. It's one of the things, again, that Jeremy minds incredibly well. And Trevor Bowen, who wrote this adaptation, has built on that. There's a scene later where Huxtable gets infuriated at what he assumes to be Holmes's levity.
The actor Christopher Benjamin actually makes a brilliant fleshing out of the character here of Huxtable, doesn't he? In this scene, where he is very concerned about his own position, but also partly because it's going to reflect on him if this boy is not found.
His country seat is across the valley from the Priory School. The Duke is an intensely solitary man. He abhors the prospect of public scrutiny. But such is his anxiety in this matter that his Grace is prepared.
Locations were Chatsworth House.
Is that Lyme Park, I'm feeling?
Oh, might it be Lyme Park? No, we filmed at Chatsworth.
Right.
We filmed at Chatsworth. Oh, the interiors may be Lyme Park.
I'm just thinking that window, it looks like...
I'm sure that's right, yeah. No, we didn't film any interiors at Chatsworth, but we filmed in the estate and the exterior.
You have failed only in describing the villainy.
This is a classic kind of composition, this, with Jeremy in the foreground.
He was at
Watson
his peak in this particular programme, wasn't he?
Jeremy?
Yes.
Yes.
And you managed to get him to wear the deerstalker later on,
Yes.
because he hated that, didn't he?
He did. Well, he didn't want to be uniquely associated with that, but I think he felt it was somewhat infra-dig, yes.
Yes, yeah.
Not the most elegant of headgear. I just, was just watching this because there's a classic kind of moment here.
This affair has been deplorably handled.
I feel it and admit it.
What form did the demand for ransom take?
There has been none. You see,
No demand for ransom.
none.
Well, the bicycle was a farcical element of the original story, where Conan Doyle made the point that tried to make the point that you could tell the direction by the pressure of the wheels.
Which actually is not true, is
you
it?
can't possibly do that because
I
the wheels go in, follow over one another, so you can't do that. And I think you eradicated that, or you and Trevor eradicated that from the plot, which was good. What about Edward Hardwicke then? He was fairly new to the role of Watson. In
I think it was this the first series that he'd
He was
done?
the first series, yes.
Yes. He's the most fantastic casting, I think, and I think just does absolutely wonderful things. He's the point of entry to the story in literary form, isn't he? He's the kind of the common man, the raisonneur, the person who takes the reader's role in the story. And Edward has that kind of wonderful, extraordinarily sympathetic kind of everyman quality, and he's a superb foil for Jeremy.
And he has to do so much with expression and glances, doesn't he?
Yeah.
Because the script doesn't necessarily, because of the very nature of the character, because obviously in the originals he's the narrator, so he doesn't say very much. And it's all just by glances and the odd word, as he's just done there. There's this lovely moment here where Huxtable says, "I'm the author of The Sidelights of Horace. Have you heard of it?" And Holmes says, "No," and he's carrying his on.
Not interested.
Not at all.
I think another thing that just occurs to me as I watch this again, that just from a purely kind of cinematic standpoint, Jeremy's kind of sense, almost kind of balletic sense of movement was extraordinarily and a very important part of the way you make the film, the way you put it together, because it's something that I would say to him quite frequently is, at a certain moment, I'd say, "Can you just give me a cut here?" Which means, can you be aware that I'm actually going to want to cut this shot at a particular moment? And a cut having power or flowing through seamlessly very often has to do with the action that immediately precedes it. So that the cut is articulated by a glance of the eyes or a turn of the head or a pipe dropping onto a piece of paper or whatever it may be. And he has the most incredible kind of dynamic, Jeremy, and a way of interweaving physical action with the line or the dramatic development in the line.
He's almost like a mime artist, right? Mm-hmm. The use of his hands and the expressions, isn't he?
Well, that means the two doctors can picnic away to their heart's content on the train. Even I may find my appetite is keener for a few days in the bracing atmosphere of the Peak Country.
And then obviously now it's starting to open out as a film a little bit.
And here we've got...
this is typical, by the way, I'm just noticing. Jeremy was sitting up on 2 or 3 boxes, so he was unquestionably the highest figure in the carriage.
Earl of Blackwater, Sir Cathcart Soames, they've all entrusted their sons to me. You can't see Holderness Hall from here, but there's a very fine view from...
And wearing the deerstalker, as I said
Indeed.
earlier, yes, which was good.
This is Haddon Hall.
Yeah. And you must have used a fair number of extras here, the little boys.
We did. They came from a nearby school, I think.
And did you use the interiors of Haddon Hall for this?
We did. I dare say, certainly the number of interiors. I know we shot, for example, at, I never know it's pronounced Chetham's or Cheatham's in Manchester, with some of the interiors, which I'll point out later. And we also used a house in Bolton, I think, called something in the Wood. House in the Wood or something like that.
Where is the letter now? It cannot be found. It must have been on the...
I remember working very hard, or working to keep a constant kind of contrast in terms of the rhythm of scene to scene in this. So you will often have tremendous bustle followed by peace and stillness, or movement followed by stillness.
Jeremy was very fond of certain props. The walking stick and the long black scarf, which are both, from the terms of the stories, uncanonical. But he seems almost to be attached to that scarf most of the time. Did he say anything about that, or was just he just assumed he'd do it and nothing was said about it?
I think he was, Jeremy was a dandy, and one of the qualities that he exhumed, I suppose, in the character, disinterred in the character, was that kind of dandiness, that dandification, which was really there, but not necessarily something that would need to be emphasised. But Jeremy loved that, the sense of showmanship in the character, and the kind of grace and style of his mind was kind of externalized, I think, in the way that he dressed. He wanted to look good. Most movie actors do, and why not?
Yes. The series was tremendous in attracting all kinds of named actors who wanted to be guest stars or an appearance. And you've got Alan Howard in this. What memories do you have of Alan?
Well, I'd done a film with him the year before. It was a story set in North Norfolk called Poppyland. And he just seemed to fit the character incredibly well. Not actually in terms of its physical description, because he was described as having a very long red beard in the book, but the kind of melancholy of the man and the sense of a very kind of great figure who was internally flawed is something that he's fantastically good at playing.
The shot we've just seen there to me is very reminiscent of Rathbone playing Holmes. That lovely profile with the deerstalker. I mean, to so many people, that is the epitome of Sherlock Holmes.
Well, you've got so many things
wonderful.
Yes. You've got so many, as you say, iconic elements that you can play with when you're constructing this kind of story. Here's a typical Jeremy thing. It's just that look away before.
And the hand behind the back.
Yes, well, and he knows he's controlling the shot the moment he comes into it, even though he's got his back to you.
Yes, he did say that he developed that, and then he was annoyed that David Suchet used to do something similar in Poirot. And he said, I invented that first. And Holmes and Jeremy are never better when they're in this sort of confrontational situation here between the Duke of Holderness and himself. And as always, Holmes gets the upper hand because he knows what's really afoot.
First, to take as few people as possible into his confidence.
I'm sorry, Mr. Wilder. The matter is easily remedied. Mr. Sherlock Holmes can return to London by the morning train.
Oh, hardly that. Hardly that. I enjoy your...
Love that line in the script, and it's actually from the original story. A lot of the dialogue in this story is from the original story, in fact.
I've often thought that this story must have elements of Conan Doyle's own life in it, because it's the only Sherlock Holmes story that is set so far north of London. It's supposed to be, the place is Mackleton in the Peak District, but it's obviously Castleton in real life. And of course, Conan Doyle went to school in Lancashire at Stonyhurst College,
Yes.
which was a very severe Jesuit school. It's a school that sort of thrashed religion out of him almost. And
Yes.
I suppose later in life that's why he was in search of something else and handed on spiritualism. And I often think that the school is a kind of Stonyhurst establishment,
Yeah, I think
where,
that's an
where
interesting
boys
point.
would want to leave.
Yes. It's unusual, this story, because there is a psychological depth to it that's not to be found in all of them. I mean, Holderness is a tragic figure, really, who loses one son in order to regain another.
Well, again, this reflects to some extent on Conan Doyle's own life, because he in a sense lost his own father to alcoholism and then later to mental illness. And I do think that there is a thread running through a lot of the later stories about infidelities and ruined marriages and the sort of debris that children have to pick up afterwards.
Or myself will be available to provide you with any assistance that you might require. Might I ask whether you...
Jeremy had just worth talking about his kind of sense of the camera. He had an extraordinary sense always of how to hold energy in a frame. He understood instinctively the moment that the camera had arrived on him. I was using this technique a great deal in this film, where the shot either develops onto him or he arrives in a shot that he doesn't exist in before, and he immediately takes control of the energy when the camera reaches him. I mean, the shot you were describing earlier, where ending up on the profile of him, and at the beginning when he sits up into the frame after Huxtable's collapsed.
He had that marvellous facility, didn't he, to adapt, because, his early career was very much on stage. He was, regarded as a great stage actor, and then came to television properly maybe in the late 70s, doing Rebecca and so forth. And he was able to adapt to both mediums very easily, which some actors do not do.
Yeah.
I think. Would you agree with that?
I would. I think he had I think when you're doing it regularly on the sort of basis that he was, you actually learn your skills, you hone your skills, and he got better and better and better at doing that.
I remember Michael Cox said that he'd never seen Jeremy on stage, and when he was doing the play, the Sherlock Holmes play, and it came to Manchester, Michael went to see it in the theatre there, very big theatre in Manchester, and he said, I was amazed how Jeremy grew to meet the audience, and he said, I've been so used to him doing it minutely on the TV set and so forth.
Yes.
And a lovely image of Watson there, that long coat and the moustache. I mean, Hardwick was really the epitome of the Watsons.
There are decidedly points of interest in connection with it. Here, look at this map. There are certain...
This is the same Liber Armee that was composed by Patrick Gowers for this story that you're hearing in the background again, the one that you heard at the beginning of the story.
He contributed so much atmosphere and feeling, didn't he, the Patrick Gowers,
yes.
to the not just to this episode, but so much of the series. It's rich in quality.
The police had reports from all over the place on a man...
And this was filmed in Haddon Hall, we're thinking now.
I think this was filmed in the house in Bolton, whose name, with a strange name, but I can't remember exactly what the name is. Essentially, you kind of, it's most unlikely that you're going to be able to find everything that you want in any film in one place, so you're often matching the outside of the building with the inside of something else, and we would kind of grab scenes where we could.
That's where Granada was so lucky, really, in a sense that within 50 miles radius of the studio, there were so many wonderful houses, which could be used, period houses. It could be backdrops and interiors and so forth. The good thing about this particular episode, which was lacking in later ones, is that we do see Holmes doing detective work.
We do. Well, that's in the story. This is the scene I was referring to earlier, which was just a nice kind of juxtaposition of perceived flippancy, I suppose, on Huxtable's part.
A warrior class, ingenious, daring, but the basis of their wealth.
Which actually, of course, is a setup, really, because Huxtable is, at this point, obsessed with the idea that Heidegger is the... this is a great shot.
Yes, yeah. Again, it's the bursting of the pomposity, isn't it?
Yes, yes, absolutely.
What is the matter, Dr. Huxtable?
It is nothing.
But it's clearly something.
He's a very good foil for Holmes, this character.
And it also shows that Holmes has done his homework about the family and everything. So it's
yeah. This is just some nice things going on. It's a colour that Edward's incredibly good at doing. This moment earlier where he was having some, probably some rather well-earned mirth and laughter and relaxation in a difficult situation, suddenly realises that he's transgressing on somebody else's pain is something that he's fantastically good at doing.
And it's all through facial, no dialogue to cover that.
You see, the pipe, the way he uses the pipe in that shot is not something everybody would do, but it works because he knows where the frame is and he knows how to use the frame graphically.
And Brett's voice is so good, isn't it? Because when he's excited, he can raise it to quite a high pitch. And then, as you say, Dr. Huxtable, very low.
Yeah. This is a nice kind of solution, really. A way of just dramatising an explanation, which actually makes physically vivid what happened, using Watson as the stand-in, as it were. But again, he was able to construct a shot which is controlled by an idea here. This is sort of typical of how amazingly well the stories lend themselves to film, I think.
Yes.
Because this is literally enacting the story here.
But it's also the cleverness of the scripting, that because so many of the Doyle stories start with flashbacks, and you've not resorted to that here.
No.
It's a sort of involving the characters of the current situation and dramatising it, and I think that works brilliantly well.
Well, I think you always want to try and harness the momentum of the story, and to the point that you choose to come into it is the crucial thing, really.
And that lovely, it's a Gothic lighting, isn't it, that you've achieved there with that particular scene, because of the strong Gothic element in the Holmes stories, which is often missed, I think. And then you've actually now gone into the...
Yes, which is now Heidegger.
Across the rooftops in the gate tower, the boy has been waiting for darkness, knowing that his flight must not be observed.
But again, it's something about... you could say that he writes cinematically, because he does, actually. It's not... Once you start to perceive ways of opening these stories up and visualizing them, you have all kinds of things that you can achieve editorially, just to kind of animate them as film.
How closely did you work with Trevor Bowen on this particular
Pretty
script?
Closely. Because my feeling is you really have to make the film in the script in the first instance, and I certainly planned this out pretty carefully, and where I felt that, I couldn't necessarily, or maybe there was something that could be adjusted in some way to allow it to come alive visually, then Trevor was incredibly keen to do that. I mean, we had two collaborations, this one and Lady Frances Carfax, which we carried that idea much further, actually, and because it was not as strong a story, that one, as the Priory School, so we kind of went back to first principles and built it from the ground up.
Now, these are wonderful shots of the moors. I mean, do you have people to find these locations for you, or did you do this?
Once you've kind of selected your basic area, I mean, obviously this was, in this case, dictated by the story, one just goes and hangs out up there until, you start to feel, I mean, in some cases you're looking for something the script describes, in other cases you're developing the script around opportunities that are offered by the landscape. For example, I mean, obviously in that case, it's just a good image, so you go with that. But where they find Heidegger in due course,
that's a wonderful shot,
is up by a kind of outcrop of rocks, which is, not strictly speaking what happened in the book, and not necessary really that one be that faithful to it, but obviously visually it works much more strongly.
Yes, I mean the scene with the crossing the stream there, you've got sort of bones of a dead animal, which is sort of is almost a precursor of finding Heidegger later.
Yes, this is the outcrop I was referring to, by the way.
Yeah.
Yes.
That is very dramatic. That is Dartmoor. I've said this before, that these moody scenes are so reminiscent of the Dartmoor scenes. And, it would have been wonderful to do that. Now we're coming up to one of my favourite scenes in this, where Watson, there's a running sort of joke through the series about Watson being hungry and so forth, and Holmes starts to just think about the case while Watson is desperate to find somewhere to eat, and Holmes apparently is not listening to Watson. He's concentrating, as you can see now, wonderfully demonstrated there. Well, Watson is saying, I think there's an inn somewhere here. And when he finally says, I'm going to find this inn, Jeremy breaks and says, you food, you must be hungry. And I think it's funny, but it also it paradoxically shows the closeness of the two men, that they can be sitting side by side, but each doing totally different things, and also the separateness of them, the genius and the sort of basic man, but
Yes, I mean, one of the pole that you're always working with, the kind of magnetic north of the story, is Holmes's concentration on, the speculative future he's not yet completely been able to penetrate. So you're constantly working with that idea that he's in his own world and Watson is somewhere else. And this one, as you say, is kind of a nice joke, really, to pay it off.
Lunch, of course, my dear fellow, you must be starving. Now,
because I think with all the mysteries and the investigative work that Holmes and Watson are involved in, it is always important to show that why these two men are stuck together. There is a sort of bond between them. Wonderful. Was that just an accident, or was it? Or did you have the train bird?
No, we had the train birds there. There. The thing about when you're working with stories of some density like this, you particularly mystery stories, you're always looking for ways in which to enrich the texture so that there are clues everywhere or things pointing forward and backward or what have you. Because hopefully, obviously, they'll reward repeated viewing.
John, could I ask you a little bit about the technical side of the production? What kind of shooting schedule did you have for this? What kind of length?
My memory is that we had 3 weeks to shoot them. So I suppose I can remember what the running time would have been, about 48 minutes or something. So, roughly we would be shooting, as it were, one part, since they're always in 3 parts, 3 acts. It was a really fast schedule. Probably, actually, it probably hasn't changed much in television terms. By film standards, it's a fast schedule. And if you're going for quite a sort of sophisticated style, any long developing shots or what have you, those things need to be finessed carefully if they're because they're only good if they're perfectly executed. So they were quite tricky, but you had a largely, not an entirely dedicated crew, but a lot of the same people were working on the films. You would have, for example, the same operator almost all the time, or one or two operators, one of two or three cameramen, and so forth. So people knew very much what they were and weren't doing. Jeremy had a kind of shorthand with the crew to an extent. We also rehearsed this quite a bit, or I certainly did. I don't know if everybody did that, but I think people knew what the shots were ahead of time, and we'd rehearsed the text of the scene quite a lot because I knew we were going to be really up against it when we came to film it. Which all of those things just help you to be able to move more swiftly when you get there.
I worked there for 15 years.
This is again a lovely scene. It's a follow-on from the scene where where Watson was talking about finding somewhere to eat, and so you're in the inn. Holmes has refused food, which is typical of Holmes. He's just going on adrenaline.
Just had a line of cocaine, I expect.
Tobacco, and Watson is given the most revolting food. In fact, he does say something like it's revolting.
Yes.
But then he continues to eat it, which is always amusing.
Left far apart. What animal would make such a scratch?
Probably a descendant of Champion Jack.
Cockfighting is forbidden by law.
Yeah, the cockfighting bit there is a bit of a red herring, isn't it?
Little bit. Yes.
And was it a series that was quite tightly budgeted? I mean, were you really up against it on that, or was it quite luxurious?
I don't remember there being any tremendous restriction because, as we were saying earlier, the locations that we were using, actually in the Lake District, obviously we did have to travel and therefore house the crew there for some period of time, but we as much as possible would obviously be done within reach of the studio. Just as, Morse's Oxford was never really shot in Oxford. It was always shot in any pub with with some water outside and passed off as Oxford. But I don't remember there being much restriction in terms of what I wanted to do. If I wanted a crane, as long as I didn't want a crane for every single shot, that was considered okay. And, to me, it was not a matter of expense, really, or thousands of extras, or, you get your extras where and when you can. You have to try and be clever about it. And but the things that really cost an awful lot of money, which are time and people, were things that I felt, I had enough of in this, really, to do what was necessary. This is Chatsworth.
It's a wonderful shot, that, isn't it?
Yeah.
The horses crossing.
Yeah.
In a sense, too big a house, really, for not Autor. But
it was. He's isn't it, in the story? He's made out to be a man of sort of colossal importance, isn't he?
True, yeah.
In Hallamshire. No, I mean, yes, it is quite big, but again, I think you can.
Again, we're not in Chatsworth here, are we?
No, we're not. We're not. No, not Chatsworth were not willing to allow us to shoot inside, but we were able to shoot outside.
And both Edward and Jeremy were horsemen then. They were able to do those shots without...
Yes, they were. This is a very tricky thing to pull off. You can't tell what the hell those things are.
Yes, this is the key.
But frankly, even you could spend half an hour explaining the cloven horseshoes, and people won't really get it.
His Grace will be joining us shortly. We are placing high hopes on your skills, Mr. Holmes. Do you bring news?
There is just one point.
Did you have any say in the casting at all, or suggestions of casting? I mean,
in what sense?
For this particular episode, were you suggesting anybody who would play certain parts? I mean,
oh yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, one had complete freedom with the film, except for characters obviously who were already established.
Yes,
Holmes and Watson, obviously, and Mrs. Hudson and Lestrade and so forth. But, canonical characters were already cast. But beyond that, no, one had a totally free hand. I mean, there was a culture in those days, and I guess there still is to some extent, of encouraging and respecting filmmaking, as it were, and a certain amount of directorial kind of identity was encouraged. People were expected to respond to the stories not in terms of a house style, but in terms of making the film they wanted to make, which is why I think they've lasted, and that series, that idea has been carried on in other series like other Granada series, certainly Cracker and Prime Suspect, and Morse was very much built on those principles.
Well, Jeremy was very keen to make sure that it was as authentic to Doyle as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Did you find him making suggestions in that direction?
Oh yes, there's certainly places he wouldn't go and places where he would. I mean, if the idea appealed to him, then it would always work. But he'd absolutely internalised the character, and I felt that he did an enormous service to the character, I think, in making him dramatically kind of fascinating as well as intellectually fascinating. Because obviously he could be a much more passive creation. This is a classic.
Mr. Holmes? Someone driving cattle. You don't happen to know if the cattle on the moor...
What about them? I hope you have seen none.
There's a wonderful way in the way he says things that, the mind is racing ahead of the mouth's ability to articulate the thoughts.
For such an extravagant man, he had a remarkable stillness,
Mm-hmm.
didn't he, with himself, and the eyes say so much.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Old shoes and new nails. Old shoes and new nails.
That's a key line, isn't it? And Michael Cox said, I hope the audience realise what's the import of that.
Well, I took some liberties here, obviously. You've got some fairly essential explanation that's being carried on over, shots which actually have some visual dynamic to them.
Now, I love this shot of Heidegger's fingers. Again, this is something you've created, presumably, that where we see the dead body, and not the dead body, but just the fingers alone, which
but obviously the vultures, as it were, the ravens of the north, or whatever, vultures of the north, whatever he calls them, he hasn't noticed before and he has now.
German master.
I mean,
this is again. You see, Jeremy, I need your stick for this shot because the camera obviously has an enormous distance to travel to get up to his face, and it's much more powerful to do that in a shot that travels rather than
a link to
in a simple cut.
Yeah. But here again we go, so the wonderful atmosphere of the moorland and so forth.
You just try and find ways that you can let the film breathe. I always tried to use the widest possible shots where you could place in conjunction with very, very powerful close-ups. Just try and get as much going on in the frame as you can at the time.
Now, in the original story, when Holmes discovers the mystery or the reason for the boy being abducted, it's very much an anticlimax. So there must have been a discussion about what you do with that, because as a TV movie, it would be very flat. Just say, well, you're a naughty boy, off you go to Australia, which is what happens in the story.
Yes. Well, we've obviously placed. This is the point at which you realise that Wilder is the one you should have had your eye on the whole time. And obviously the story is now accelerating tremendously. And in this version, of course, we've still got something to fight for, because it's not so much just an intellectual conclusion that they arrive at, which is what it is in the book, where Holmes has actually put everything together and realised everything except for the fact that Wilder is the Duke's son. But here we've got elements of the chase, obviously, which are classic movie form, and is kind of powering the narrative along in a kind of more visceral way. And this is all invented. Although the publican's wife is referred to because she looks after the boy, doesn't she, in the book?
Yes, yes. But as you said, the whole thing has gone through a series of climaxes, which meets a high point with the discovery of Heidegger with that wonderful shot of the fingers, and now it is. It's wonderful going in different directions there.
I know.
Yes. But Jeremy on the bike.
I know. He loved this idea.
Yes, that is a super shot too, isn't it? The silhouette of.
Yes, it's pretty iconic.
I mean, in a way, you break so many sort of standard ideas of Holmes in this particular one, with on a horse, on a bike, which I don't think you ever get in the stories, really. Certainly not images created by the illustrators.
No.
And this is where it gets cruel, isn't it?
Yes.
With the two sons, if you like.
I heard actually from Nisar Modi, the boy who played Lord Saltire, wrote to me about 5 or 6 years ago. Now a grown man, of course,
yes,
and very interested in film. But he came to visit me on a set of a film I was making.
Is he an actor?
I don't know if he's actually acting, but he wants to get into film, certainly. He got bitten by the bug, I'm sure, on this. This is absolute kind of classic Brett, all of this stuff.
Yes.
This is brilliant performance here.
But I possess the proofs. It is beyond debate. The mud is scarcely dry upon the cloven horseshoes in your casements. Why do you doubt my word?
This sort of battle of wills, isn't it?
Yes,
Wonderful battle
just
of
the
wills.
vocal dynamic,
Yes,
the way he
yes.
attacks and then pulls back.
And I mean, do you think Howard matches him in this? And are they? Did they get on well together at all? Or?
Who? Jeremy and Alan?
Yeah.
Yes, very much so. Very much so. He had great respect for Alan, I think, and Alan did for him.
How long has Mr. Wilder been...
I mean, Alan was, one of the great stage actors, still is, but was, absolutely playing everything at the time. And I think Alan had enormous respect for Jeremy's skill with the medium, because it's exemplary, really. I can't speak of it highly enough. It's kind of a gift for a director.
Yes, I mean, one regrets so much about what happened towards the end of Jeremy's life. I mean, he has all the facilities to be one of the great screen actors.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. And I'm sure would have been. I'm sure he'd have come into his own if...
Well, I think part of his
film
curse,
actor,
if you like, was his beauty, wasn't it, in early life? He was such a good-looking, handsome man, but a lot of sort of...
Well, he also suited period incredibly well. That's... But there's no reason. I think he would have made a sensational villain, for example. He'd have turned up in a Bond film before long.
Yes, yes. There was a story that he was once considered for Bond.
Yeah, I'm sure that's possibly true.
Such a match might mar my career.
Am I not right in thinking, John, that your son actually had a brief part in this as well?
Yes, but like all inappropriate things, he ended up on the cutting room floor. No, it's true, he did. I mean, it seemed in my naivete at that point, I thought, well, I was staying up in the Lake District and my family came up with me. And he was a boy of the age that most of the boys at the school were. And it was an interesting thing, actually, because we did a shot where he was running across the quadrangle and then Jeremy emerged from a door, and Jeremy actually got quite upset about it and went into a kind of funk for about 2 or 3 days, and nobody could understand why, and I spotted it fairly quickly, and I said, I'm sure I understand why. And after about 3 or 4 days, I broached it with him and apologized, and I said, I think you're upset because I put my son in the film, and I think I was out of order doing that, because I think that he felt that I was perhaps more interested in getting my family airtime than I was. Actually, I don't think he did really think that, but I think that's what it was about. And you might say that's a very vain actor's kind of reaction, but he, as I was telling you earlier, he was on that occasion, he said, it's only that I feel it has to be Olympian, which meant that he treated every single story as if it was, some extraordinary kind of heroic epic challenge, and he wanted each one to be perfect and to do something, achieve something extraordinary. which may sound absurdly indulgent, but actually it's kind of wonderful, that obsessiveness and that aspiration to get somewhere you haven't been before is what makes them distinctive and what makes his performance so distinctive. So I felt my knuckles were suitably wrapped by that. Not the reason I cut him, I hasten to add, it's just the film was running too long.
But he was very proprietorial about the whole process.
He was, and he deserved to be.
It was not so much his show, but he wanted it to be so good, didn't he?
Yes,
yeah.
Plenty of running here.
Yes.
And this is obviously the whole kind of denouement that we invented, really. Trevor invented, we invented for this story, which is to take advantage of the other notable geographic feature of the Peak District.
Even the outside scenes are very dark, but I mean particularly the interiors throughout the whole of this is very dark, as though you're reflecting the darkness of the...
Yeah.
Because I mean, in a sense, it's a very terrible story, isn't it?
It is. It's a very unhappy story. It's a very tragic story. Both of them are. Both the ones that I did were, and I kind of cleaved to that, I think, because it gives them kind of tragic weight. I mean, Wilde is a pathetic figure, really.
And at the end, although Lord Saltire gets his real son back, he loses his his other son.
It's a kind of Sophie's choice, really, isn't it? He gains one child and loses another, and that kind of sadness underlies the whole thing. And I think it was always good that it was a nice kind of turn that one was then able to achieve, because the Holmes character so much of the time appears to be so insensitive to what's going on, so caught up in the intellectual acrostic, the puzzle of the story and solving it, that his heart seems to be asleep. But it always affords you that moment when he sees and senses and understands the pain of the situation that he's dealing with.
These are really super scenes, are they? That must have taken an awful lot of setting up, with so many people and in such conditions. Can you say something about that?
Well, I think it was always you try and earn yourself the room in these things. You have to achieve a certain number of pages per day, as it were, in a film schedule. And often, of course, what that means is you might spend one day where you manage to achieve an enormous amount of screen time because there's a lot of dialogue and the coverage is relatively simple. And then you might spend 2 days achieving something like this, which is a much more complicated setup in terms of lighting and access and so forth, but actually gives it a little bit of cinematic scope and so on. And that's always true, really, but you've got to... I think if you're going to be responsible, which you have to be if you're working within a television budget and schedule, or you won't get employed again, you have to kind of create that room for yourself, really, by figuring out how you're going to deal with something more simply and more effectively in order to be able to get the time and resources you need elsewhere.
But I think this also shows how Granada and yourself were so far ahead of the times, really. I mean, if this had been filmed 2 or 3 years earlier than that, you'd probably been in plaster boulders in the studio, wouldn't you? And,
they were always very... they were kind of leading the field in those days, Granada. I mean, you've got to remember they'd made A Brideshead by this point and Jewel in the Crown, and, they really were leading the field, and they had an enormous emphasis on film, which really preceded the BBC's emphasis on it. I mean, things like Screen 1 and Screen 2 had only just begun at this point, which were the big, the really what amounted to the British independent film industry at the time. And Granada were, yes, absolutely leading it.
And there's this lovely moment where he gets a cheque, isn't it? And as you say, that was a nice phrase used earlier, that Holmes's heart seems to be asleep for most of it. But you do get the sense of...
yes.
Perhaps that's not the case.
Well, you always get the sense that, he's obviously Holderness's equal, isn't he, in many ways? And I always like to kind of sound that note of humanity the story, the printed story, ends with a rather odd, slightly uncharacteristic joke, actually, with Holmes trousering the £6,000 or £12,000 cheque and saying it's the best thing that's happened to him for the last 10 years. The exact opposite of what I'm talking about.
A long penance, it has seemed.
You obviously enjoyed both your experiences with Holmes. I mean, would you ever go back to him?
I'm sure I would.
Obviously, you're not going to get Jeremy Brett.
Well, I think that's the tough part of it. I think he has left such an indelible impression, really, that it's hard to imagine.
Thank you, Mr. Holmes.
It's hard to imagine somebody bettering it. And look what he does with the cheque here at the end, you see. And he knows exactly where it is relative to his mouth and his nose. It's wonderful. And that little exhalation there. That's the moment where the two actors, I think, acknowledge one another in a funny kind of a way.
Yes. It's a brilliant film. It's a brilliant film. And it's, to me, it's one of Jeremy Brett's best performances of Holmes, because you get so much. You get the mental stimulation, and you get the excitement of the man of action when he's lifting up the candle and on the horse, on the bike. It's a real combination of what Sherlock Holmes is seen as a hero.
Yes.
Too often he is shown just sitting in a chair, smoking a pipe, saying, yes, I think that's the answer. But here we get a combination of the whole thing.
Well, I think you have a kind of a duty with this kind of thing, to render excitement, and I don't mean the excitement just has to be a physical and visceral thing, but that was as I said, the contribution that Jeremy made to it, really.
Yeah.
The stories are at their best intellectually exciting, and sometimes you have to, as with Lady Frances Carfax, to kind of work to fashion a kind of intellectual excitement that isn't immediately offered. But I think, I felt you just had to make a proper film. You had to make a good film that people, if they started watching it, would watch to the end.
No problem there, then.
Okay. John Madden, Stuart Davies, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.